Hello, it's Katya or Toxic Art. I love painting self-portraits. Now, to some that might sound conceited or vain, but there's so much more under the surface that I want to talk about. Many artists tend to stay away from painting portraits of themselves, and I've noticed that there's usually just one main reason for this, aside from the artists who are not interested in painting any type of portraits. Although I still think they can be beneficial to all artists, no matter the subject matter you're most drawn to. This number one reason is usually because artists may be self-conscious or not comfortable enough with some of their features. They might not want to share certain aspects of themselves and would rather paint people they know or even strangers, since they're able to see the beauty in others. They could also just be uncomfortable with the idea of sharing art that is of themselves, which viewers might perceive as them thinking the artist just loves looking at their own face. Even though I myself have always struggled with confidence in the way I look, I have still always gravitated toward drawing and painting self-portraits. Even when I first got started with oil painting, it just made sense to me to paint myself, and here's why. Finding reference photos of people to use for paintings has never been fun for me. I always want to make sure that when I do use photos for bigger paintings, they are free from copyright so that I'm not using someone else's work. In turn, this made it harder to get inspired or know what to look for that would fulfill the ideas I had in my mind. When you're looking for photos to use, it can be hard to search the right terms, and you can end up with photos that are slightly off from the pose or lighting that you originally wanted. This can be very unsatisfying and frustrating to deal with. So I turned to creating my own reference photos, and the person I have access to photograph at all times is, of course, myself. In the beginning, it started as taking pictures on my phone with a self-timer, but as I got more invested and started to see the value in this, I started spending more time using my camera and really experimenting with the kinds of photos I could get of myself. I pushed myself out of my comfort zone and realized how much more fun and creative my process had become. So the question you might still be asking is, why? Since there's still time that goes into taking your own photos, why not spend that time looking for photos of other people so that you aren't painting your own face? Yes, there might be drawbacks to searching for other reference photos, but it still might be easier or even less of a hassle in the end. My answer to that is because I have found that my creativity as an artist really falls into the process of crafting the reference for my paintings. Art does not always have to be about the finished product or the final piece. There is art in the process itself. When I first started with art, everything I created was from other people's photos, and I could never figure out how to be more creative with art. I felt stuck. I would copy these photos, and as time went on, I kept improving my skills and got better at creating realistic pieces, yet I always felt like I wasn't creative. Now, one of my favorite parts of the process of creating a new painting is the photo shoot aspect. I love getting to play with the light coming through the window at different times of the day and the shadows that are created, or even the reflections from holding a mirror. I might also then do some editing either to a single photo that I want to use, or I will combine some, meshing them together to form something new. Adjusting the colors, saturation, and contrast brings me to a reference photo that I can then paint directly from, one that I had total control over, and one that I'm happy with. Then I don't have to think as much during the painting process, wondering what I might want to add or change to make it more interesting. Instead of worrying about whether an idea will eventually come to mind so that the piece has more meaning, I can focus on the technical aspect since at least the majority of the idea has been completely fleshed out in the planning phase. Let's talk a little bit more about my process for my paintings, in particular the ones of myself. During times when I might not feel inspired by any of the previous photos I have taken, I'll decide that it's time to do another photo shoot. Nothing I do is ever that fancy, and I have only experimented a little with props. I would definitely love to do more with incorporating objects into my self-portraits in the future. So far, I have used part of a broken mirror and a human skull. Using objects gives you endless ways to switch up these self-portraits if you're someone who thinks that painting yourself over and over again would get boring. You can also play with distance, either being further away with more of yourself in the frame, or cropping it super close up so that you can only see your eyes and nose. With the camera I use, I'm able to connect it to my phone or laptop using Bluetooth so that I can control it that way instead of using the buttons on the camera itself. This way, it's much easier to use the self-timer and try different poses where I don't have to hold the camera or be very close to it. It also means it's easier to take photos quickly so that I'm able to take as many photos as I want, changing the pose even just the slightest amount for some of them. Most of the time, I have no idea what I want to capture going into it. It really is just about having fun. I can try out different expressions, use my hands, and throughout it all, I am my own director. While this could be stressful to some, I think there's something really special about being able to craft your own reference, giving even more of yourself to that final piece. Although I don't go in with an idea most of the time, and it's just about trying new things, as I go through the process, I figure out what I like and want the photos to look like. This means I end up with way too many photos. However, I can save them and keep them for any other time I might be feeling uninspired. There are also usually a few favorites that come out of each session that I think I might want to go back to. The picture that I used for this piece actually came from a session of photos that I took for a different painting that I did in the summer. I saved it and knew that I would eventually want to paint it, and so here I am. Once I have decided on my favorite or most interesting photo of the dozens I took, I think about how I might want to edit it. Most of the time I just fix the exposure, shadows, and contrast. However, this is also the time that I can up the saturation or change the hue if I don't love the colors. Depending on what size surface I want to paint on, I also play around with cropping at this point too. Most of the time, the photo that I'm using gets cropped in much tighter, and I might have to change the aspect ratio as well to fit my canvas or paper. Sometimes I like to edit multiple different photos or even two of the same together as well, giving it a blurred or 3D effect. Or I'll include some photos of roses or other flowers that I took into the reference, which is definitely one of my favorite things to add. At this point, I am left with my own curated reference photo that I'm ready to paint from, and much of the thinking and planning is done. Of course, this doesn't mean my process is completely linear. This painting is a perfect example of that. I had turned the reference photo to black and white to help with understanding the values, and I discovered how much I liked how it looked in grayscale as well. Obviously, I didn't want to start over or do two separate pieces, one in color and one in black and white, so I decided to pivot, and I had the idea to keep part of my face in color and then fade to grayscale for the other part. This way, my brain could be happy, and I could do both. Every artist has their own unique process when creating. What I have learned is that it can take some time to learn what your unique process is. So, if you're feeling lost or not satisfied with your finished pieces, I would suggest taking a look at your process. Maybe, like me, your creativity lies not so much in the painting, but in the setting up of the reference. Now, this all ties into why I think every artist should paint self-portraits, even if it's just once in a while. Whether that be once a month, once a year, once every few years, a self-portrait is the perfect base way to experiment and learn more about yourself as an artist. And hey, if you really don't want to paint yourself, then be ambiguous with the term self-portrait. If you tend to paint objects, still life setups, or scenery, then create a reference photo with some of your favorite things, of your room, or even somewhere you visited. Creating your own reference photos not only allows you to be more in control over exactly what you want, it means you're also so much more connected to the final piece you create. You'll end up with something more personal, which might make it of more value to you, and in the end, even more unique since no one else has the exact photos you took, especially if they're of yourself. Self-portraits can also be a perfect way to measure your progress or growth, not just as an artist, but as a person as well. Being able to look back at past portraits of yourself that you created is parallel to that of a journal page. You're able to see who and where you were at the point in your life when you created it. This can depend on how curated the portrait was if it really shows how you were feeling, but it's still a good memento to look back on. Having been a part of the process of taking the reference photos yourself also allows you to remember more of the actual creation of the final piece. There's something so personal about you being an integral part of each step in creating the portrait. To me, there is so much more freedom in creating self-portraits than any other kind of portrait. When you're painting someone else, say for a commission, you want to make sure the features are precise and the client most likely won't want you to add things during the process. Using self-portraits as practice for these commissions can serve as a way of training for your brain to come up with more ideas in the brainstorming phase. This will help you get better at generating ideas before you sit down to paint and will help your process go much smoother. It can be difficult to sit down and paint if you feel like you haven't fully fleshed out an idea. Getting into the habit of planning things out first could really help if you never feel satisfied with your paintings. It could also be helpful if you're someone who doesn't know when to stop working and put the paintbrush down. Having a clear reference means having a clear end as well. Even though all of these things are not necessarily exclusive to just self-portraits, I wanted to share my thoughts on how they in particular have been the most helpful in my growth as an artist. Painting portraits of myself is when I feel most free, and also at the same time, it's when I learn the most about how I like to create. Every artist is unique in what they do or don't like. However, you also have to try new things even if you're unsure if they'll be of help to you or not. Each piece I do, I learn something, no matter how small or insignificant it might seem at the time. Even with this piece, when I thought my reference photo was exactly what I wanted, I had the spontaneous thought to make half of it grayscale in the middle of it, and instead of ignoring that thought, I went with it. Just because you start to refine your process doesn't mean you can never stray from that process. As I said before, my process is not completely linear, and that is really what keeps me coming back to creating art. So, if you're feeling like you have no idea what to create, then paint a self-portrait. If you feel like your process has become too structured, then paint a self-portrait. Just try it. You might learn something about your art, about yourself, or about both. Most of us artists are afraid of what people might think, but just remember that no one has to see all of the art that you create. If you do paint a self-portrait and you hate it, then you can keep it to yourself and no one has to see it. But also make sure to remember to find parts about the process to learn from so that you can get closer to enjoying as much of it as you can. Self-portraits are not for everyone, and they can be very personal, but they also don't have to be. Think of yourself as any other model you might use for reference. Have fun with it, experiment, and then you can look back and see how much you developed as an artist. Here is the final self-portrait painting. I really hope you enjoyed the process of watching me paint this. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye!